Thy brother's blood. =RK equals. Part 1. =RK equals. Garci P. Senate Building. Coruscant. The Chancellor and her security detail stood within a reinforced bunker hastily added to the Senate building. It was stuck into an expanded security station and had hardened links with every similar facility in the building. Clones manned multiple workstations placed around the walls, and they all fed data into a hollow tank that bolted in the middle of the room. "Mom, this isn't a good idea," Commander Cody implored. "It all depends on your perspective." Satine smiled at her chief babysitter. Obi-Wan, arranging the clone commander he knew best and trusted the most as the head of her overbearing security details, was endearing in a sense. At least when it wasn't frustrating. "I can't be seen as running. The Mandalorian people won't respect me if I do so. For most intents and purposes I'm the Republic government, right? Not. So once again, I can't be seen as running. Besides, by being here, I'm a nice juicy bait. Having the senators present, why, that's just spoiling our rebelling friends." That might very well be the case, however. "It's all right, Cody. I'm confident that you and your brothers can keep me intact." The commander tilted his head to the side and remained silent. It didn't turn out that way for Palpatine, didn't it? Cody was determined not to become the second clone who lost a chancellor. He really didn't look forward to explaining such a kerfuffle to Kenobi, especially not when the man finally shaped up in more than a competent general. The universe seemed to conspire against him. "We have multiple fast movers approaching the perimeter. They bypassed our outer sensor perimeter and we didn't get heads up from Overwatch," a clone reported. "They used the tunnels to get close, didn't they? What about the sensor grid and our listening posts?" Cody pressed for answers. "All green. They report no disturbances." A few seconds later another clone answered. "They're compromised then. Inform HICOM and the fleet. Scramble the cap and ready fighters from the nearby bases," Cody ordered. Multiple red triangles designating gunship and LART squadrons escorted by a flimsy screen of fighters appeared from multiple points inside the outer perimeter surrounding the Senate. What was their game? They lacked the numbers to crack the reinforced division stationed at the Senate, not to mention the ARC battalion under Cody's personal command that acted as the Chancellor's bodyguards. There were 3 more divisions spread around the immediate area and a significant amount of AA assets, not to mention the Senate building's theater shield. Raise the intruders and give them one chance to immediately land and surrender. Otherwise, lit them up once the inner perimeter has solid locks on them. Cody's words were final. "I'm sorry," Satine muttered. "You shouldn't be forced to fight your brothers. They made their choices and so did we." Cody grit his teeth. That didn't make giving the order any easier. Why didn't those young fools see? Supporting Satine and Obi-Wan Kenobi was in the best interests of the Republic. That's why he and most of his brothers chose to back them despite the irregular way the new Chancellor got her position. As far as he was concerned, if there were any traitors in the whole mess, those were concentrated in the Senate and were currently under armed guard in the Senate chamber. Yet, he could almost see where the youngsters were coming from. All clones were taught to be faithful to the Republic. That they had to obey its laws, to follow lawful orders and no matter what to execute any contingency order given by legitimate authority. Cody was pretty sure that even as a fresh behind-the-ears trooper when he was just deployed on Geonosis he would have done the same choice. After Order 66 was given and the fallout, not following Chancellor Satine Kenobi and General Kenobi would sheer madness. Skirting the law by supporting them did great on the commander, yet he knew what was the sane choice. He did it both for the Republic and his brothers who were stuck on the front awaiting support that was unavailable due to Order 66. It was the only one sane choice he had, as Cody continued telling himself. Why his youngest brothers couldn't see it. The law surely wasn't a suicide pact. A frustrated sigh escaped his lips. Now his hand was forced and he would have to kill his own brothers for being short-sighted fools. =RK equals. Zone B60. Gresh Sector. Undercity. Coruscant. Goosebumps rose all over Ahsoka's skin despite the medium armor that encased her from the tips of her lekku to her toes. She was in the open, surrounded only by a squad of her HQ section responsible for her security. Just a few meters away across a small hole in between platforms stood Clone Commander Orphus covered by multiple fire teams. This was their 7th meeting in a futile attempt to resolve the impasse peacefully. At least the man was still willing to speak instead of making a futile last stand. That was the best Ahsoka could say about the man, at least in public. In private, well, neither of her masters would approve of her language. She hadn't met a more dense, obstinate fool in her life. That clone made separatist officers look like paragons of reasonable thought and understanding. They were also less inclined to risk making doomed last stands. Well, unless they left their droids to do the heavy lifting while they did their best to save their asses. It wasn't like the man was buying time for something. The rogue elements of the fleet were agreeable on taking every single clone who found it unacceptable to follow Satine's orders. Once on board, they would be free to leave and go to one of the systems that wanted to secede. Honestly, that was a great concession and it was in everyone's best interest. "Have you made up your mind, Commander?" Ahsoka asked aloud. "I have. We aren't going anywhere for the time being. Perhaps tomorrow," Orpheus informed her in a cold, angry voice. Ahsoka crossed her arms above her armor's chest plate and glared. "Do you intend to stay just to make a point?" she snapped in her best officer's voice. It was a good thing she figured out how to enhance it with the Force, because otherwise the effect was somewhat underwhelming. "We have enough MREs, thank you very much, Colonel." The commander's sneer was clear in his voice. Ahsoka didn't flinch, though she wondered if she was cut off for that whole negotiating part of being a Jedi. Or an officer. Her forces were in place. He had the numbers to take out Orpheus men. If she led as the tip of the spear, her Jedi skills would ensure as few of her own people would die or get injured as possible. She knew that for a fact and was torn. The Jedi part of her was glad that they were still at the talking things through stage even if it was going nowhere fast. The officer she trained to be saw things in a different light. Commander Orpheus kept her command neutralized by his very presence. No matter if he really played for time or was simply a grumpy contrary pain in the ass because of his shiny personality, the effect was the same. Ahsoka, her regiment and attached units were stuck here watching his legion like hawks instead of doing something else that might or not be more important. How many other loyalist units on Coruscant were neutralized in a similar way or by still rioting crowds and protests? Sooner or later Ahsoka would have to make a decision. Was waiting Orpheus and his men worth it the time? The same was true for going in hot. Would a quick but bloody and ugly resolution be worth the casualties her unit would take? What about the civilians and collateral damage? Ahsoka glared at the clone commander and she was sure he did the same from under his helmet. How she wished things were as simple as they were a few months ago. =RK=, Part 2, =RK=, Chancellor's Office, Coruscant. This was weird. He couldn't recall how long he simply drifted through an endless peaceful expanse. All he could recall were dull grey colors and a sense of serenity that was simply unfathomable. It went against his very nature, he was sure of it, even if he couldn't recall what that nature was supposed to be. It made him uneasy, yet, while he didn't know what came before, he found himself finding solace in the peace. It was like a well-deserved rest after everything. Everything that what? A single tone echoed through the grey void and for the first time since he became aware, the silence clinging to the place broke. Another note came and another, then they were a crescendo of a familiar noise. Blaster fire. Explosions. The screams of the wounded and the dying. He knew those sounds. They brought a happy smile to his lips. Wait. He had lips now? He blinked in confusion. One moment he was lost in the void and now he was in a large well-lit room, familiar too, though some things were off. He knew that place. It was his. Another blink. A strange sensation prickled against the back of his mind if that made any sense. It became an itch before transforming into a dull pain. It was unpleasant, nevertheless he welcomed it, because with it came recollection. For a decade, this used to be his office, his home. It was also the place where he died. He looked around. The place didn't show any sign of the battle that claimed his life. Yet it was subtly different. While the furniture was replaced with replicas of what used to exist before, a lot of the decorations he chose for his office were gone, destroyed during the coup. He frowned. Who killed him? Why? What coup? More importantly, who was he? He looked down at himself and frowned. That was strange. He saw familiar, comforting even expensive black robes, yet they were transparent, like a hologram. Raising his hands, he found them covered by leather gloves and he could see through them too. What was happening? Wasn't he supposed to be dead? The room lightly shook. Now that he finally paid attention, the noise he heard before was all around him. There was a battle raging right on top of him. He went towards the next room where he knew a large window overlooked the vista in this part of Coruscant. The door refused to open when he neared. When they tried to hit the manual release, his hand went through the wall. His frown deepened. This reminded him of something he had heard or read about. Ghosts? A Force ghost. Was this what he was now? What did that even mean? Unable to recall, he slowly walked through the door as if it wasn't there. The Chancellor's office itself was almost the same as he remembered it, though there were a few out-of-place decorations. Mandalorian? What were they doing there? He shrugged and went to the window. There was a battle raging outside. Fighters skirmished in the air, small ships raced towards the Senate and their weapons raked everything in their paths. Missiles and green beams descended to blow up or slice anything and anyone unlucky enough to find themselves in their path. Rapid-fire blasters and guided missiles streaked up in the sky and broken ships rained burning wreckage, men and part of men all over the huge plaza below the Senate. He walked through the window and found it ridiculously easy to move up the outer wall of the building so he could better see the carnage. There was something beautiful in the battle. It called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Despite the best efforts of the defenders, some gunships did reach the Senate and managed to disgorge their loads of soldiers before fighters or AA fire could engage them. More explosions came from the far end of the plaza where a ragged line of walkers screened by hover tanks advanced at a steady pace. A transport screamed overhead and banked towards a raised platform that overlooked the grounds below. Its side doors slid back and 8 armored men rappelled down before their ride headed towards the plaza and unleashed a punishing missile barrage against the dug-in defenders. 2 projectiles struck a walker in the middle and the ensuing explosion cut it in half. Fire and debris cut through soldiers scattered by the blast wave. Another position went up in flames, yet that strafing run simply couldn't last. An AA emplacement locked on the LART and its rapid-fire blaster cannons sheared through its rear. It spun out of control and splattered itself over the metal floor of the plaza. Meanwhile, the soldiers delivered by that LART stood froze, their weapons leveled at a cinch-cloaked figure. That sight took all his attention. This was important. He knew that man. The figure grabbed his cloak with his left hand and threw it away to reveal a tall young man with a face framed by wild blonde hair. He had a cylinder gripped in his other hand and he pointed it at the soldiers. From where he stood, he couldn't hear what if anything was said. The leader of the armored men shook his head and they opened fire. A hail of blue blaster bolts rained upon the lone man who was revealed to wear an armor identical to that of his attackers. Was this a civil war? A distant part of the observer's mind wondered. The rest of his attention was concentrated upon a vibrant blue energy blade, which came from the cylinder held by the blonde. He moved in a blur that should have been hard to follow. His blade intercepted every single shot sent his way and most flew straight back at his attackers. They didn't flinch and let the fire splash over previously invisible deflectors. In response, the soldiers merely spread out to surround their targets. The blonde raised his free hand and the closest soldier on that side flew over the edge of the platform as if struck by invisible Erika. He followed with a pulling motion that disrupted the incoming fire as his enemies struggled to hold on their weapons. 2 of them failed and a pair of long blasters flew past the young man. The Jedi? That was the term, right? Why thinking about it made him angry. The man made a pushing motion at the soldiers and they braced themselves in response as if struggling against hurricane wind. Before they could recover and continue firing, he made an impossible jump at them, which for some reason didn't surprise the observer at all. On his way down, the Jedi slammed his blade into the closest soldier. The deflector held for a moment before popping off and the energy field slammed into his chest plate right above the breastbone. The armor ablated and melted, buying its wearer a moment to save himself, however his reaction was too slow. By the time he jumped back, there was a glowing hole in his breastplate and melted metal burned through his chest. The Jedi whirled around and his blade swung gracefully, shattering shields and cutting through weapons. A soldier discarded his now useless blaster and attacked with a vibroblade build in his arm guard only to have his arm caught and crushed with contemptuous ease. The remaining clones didn't last long. He nodded in approval. This Jedi? He was different. The blonde didn't instill the same hatred and distrust that his tittle did. He stared at the younger man and strained to remember. The distant face snapped in focus, though it was a bit younger now. Anakin. Anakin Skywalker, that was the blonde's name. He was a Jedi destined to become something more. He was meant to be his apprentice. He stared at the Jedi until the younger man jumped over the edge. It should have been suicidal, yet the observer knew that a Jedi could survive such a drop. Soon he was on the platform and looked at the battlefield below. Walkers and tanks clashed against Dugan infantry and half their number of the walking tanks. The battle in the skies was still ongoing and another wave of darts descended upon the Senate, this time coming from a different direction. The defenders protecting that zone opened up for all they were worth and more X rained from the sky. Watching this slaughter unfold without a care in the world was liberating. It was fun, and that was something he knew he had seldom experienced before ending up in the void. A blinding flash of light followed by deafening thunderclap and a shock wave that would have thrown him like a ragdoll if he was still made of flesh and blood came from behind. He turned around and stared. There was a huge gaping hole in the Senate building that bellowed thick clouds of oily black smoke. The metal shell of the building was cracked for hundreds of meters around the crater, a testament for the power of whatever weapon was responsible. There was a huge gap in the defensive line on that side of the building, and it soon became clear what happened. It was obvious really, the latest aerial assault had been a mere cover to allow a weapon to sneak in through the defenders. He looked beyond the smoke and nodded. There was a small but swift group of fast flyers screaming towards the breach. All told, it was a decent stratagem. The fighting paused for a moment. Then it intensified into a desperate Abaddon. == How did they get anti-ship ordnance? Obi-Wan spat a mouthful of blood from a bitten tongue. His ears rang and he could feel blood leaking from his nose and ears despite the fully enclosed helmet. If it wasn't for it and the last-moment warning from the Force, he was sure the shockwave would have killed him along with his security detail who lay dead on unconscious all around him. This is General Kenobi. The Senate is breached. Case Black. Bring the hammer down. Yularen, if the rogue fleet elements even blink in our direction, put them down, hard. Obi-Wan's voice sounded weak and distant in his own ears. His comm cracked and he heard a confirmation but wasn't sure. The Force whispered another warning. His wife and unborn child were in danger. He spat a curse and ran down a devastated corridor. He should never had agreed to this plan. Who cared if the government wasn't supposed to hide or run? Satine shouldn't be in this place acting as a bait along all the problematic senators. The same went for Padme. As he ran, Obi-Wan cursed himself for ever entertaining the thought of this plan. It was sheer madness. The buckled floor under his feet shook and he heard loud metal screech coming from behind the corner along with billowing pitch-black smoke. He pulled out his lightsaber and ignited it just in time for the outline of an armored figure to step in sight. The rebel leveled a blaster cannon at Kenobi and let loose. A large bolt of plasma flew at the Jedi who acted on instinct and lashed with a telekinetic push. Debris, smoke and 2 cannon shots flew back towards the armored soldiers who had no time to get out of the way. He vanished in the blinding glare of dual explosions, but soon more intruders took his place. They were here for his wife. That was the only thing that Obi-Wan could think at that moment. He charged and in seconds tore them apart. Beyond the corner, there was a huge rent in the wall that revealed just how large a sky darkening with gunships and assault shuttles that the Loyalists sneaked close to the Senate while the rebels were busy regrouping and making their way there. The trap was about to close its jaws around the clones most eager to die. Somehow, Obi-Wan didn't believe it was worth it. Thy brother's blood. =RK=. Part 3. =RK=. Loyalist positions. Senate building. Coruscant. Long rows of identical boys walked down well-lit corridors. They wore a sensibly designed blue garb that said safety and brotherhood. It was an old and familiar scene. It was also wrong. Those days were recently gone. He blinked away the memory. An echo of a distant thunder rang in his ears, making sure he couldn't hear a thing. The world spun and blurred into another memory. It was his first taste of combat with one of his brothers. RN-442 was in a sparring ring facing off a fellow boy. He knew their identical faces were scrunched in the same expression of deep concentration as they slowly advanced upon each other under the observation of their Mandalorian instructors. Ren heard an impatient clearing of a throat and his opponent took that as a signal to spring forth. His training kicked in and he acted without consciously thinking. The rushing boy executed right yet hasty jab at his throat that made it easier than it should to block. That nicely flowed into a counterstrike at a suddenly off-balance clone, and before he knew it, Ren stood above the prone form of his brother ready to deliver a disabling strike. But if that was what happened, why did he have the familiar coppery tang of blood in his mouth? For that matter, why did Ren feel like he went all out against all his instructors and predictably got his ass handled to him? His whole body felt like one giant bruise, and this was when he figured it out. Did he hit his head too? All he could see was grey. Blinking didn't really help, and turning his head, pain lanced through his neck and down his spine. The world tilted and blurred again. His mind must be playing tricks on him, and that was a sure strike in the head hurt column. A third memory swam in front of his eyes. For some arcane reason, it was of conflict with his brothers again, this time during a simulated combat back home, on Camino. Why did he feel such a longing at that thought, as if he knew he wouldn't see home again? Thinking about it hurt, but it was important. A part of Ren knew it was the reason why he felt as if a Walker platoon took a turn stepping on him for being a clueless crunchy, as some armor guys liked to joke around, the bastards. That particularly memory came in blurry in a contrast to the perceived precision of the last two. Perhaps it was the contests, simulated or not, a fight was an inherently chaotic place. Fake blaster bolts flew in all directions, smoke billowed obscuring the vision modes of their training helmets, and suddenly figures wearing the same light armor as Ren's own walked like ghosts from the concealment, if ghosts moved low and fast and could shoot at you. Max, the squad leader, fell first after taking a burst into the chest and helmet. Benny, the XO, fell a moment later before he could even shout a warning, much less an order. What was left of the squad scattered, leaving another two behind, and the other team vanished back into the smoke before wild counterfire could find its mark. It was only after the survivors regrouped that any of them noticed that their opponents were a head taller, a telltale sign an older generation of their brothers. With age came experience, and all else being equal, that was what usually let one side in these exercises win. They lost that simulation, as it usually happened once in a while when the instructors put an older unit to prove a point, in that case to illustrate that all their training had a very good reason behind it, but showcasing a little bit of the results. 6 months later, Ren and company fought that same older clone unit again, and that time they eked out a bloody draw. A month before the war began, they met again in another exercise, and this time it was they who won. Why any of that did matter? Why did his mind bring back up those memories? It took him a few minutes before his mind could clear enough so he could think more or less straight. There were no more such vivid recollections, just dull hum in his ears and that weird grey haze in front of his eyes. At least as long as he didn't try to move and concentrated on something else, like remembering the crash happened, somewhat distracted him from the pain. Was there an accident, or did he get wounded in combat? The ground below him shook. Something dull tried to pass through the distracting sound in his ears. It was combat then, still ongoing. Not good at all. He had to get moving, but even attempting it led to debilitating pain. Damn it, he was messed up all right. How did he end up in this mess? This time thinking about it hurt less, at least as far as his head was concerned. A pretty nasty concussion then, if he was lucky at that. He thought so anyway. It wasn't like he had the misfortune of suffering one before, but occasionally they tended to lead to weird experiences, or so the scuttlebutt claimed. Ren was on Coruscant, that much he knew. His whole unit, along with the whole Legion and the army they were nominally assigned to, got sent there to maintain order in the wake of the Chancellor's assassination. That wasn't fun. Seeing the Republic they were bred and raised go to hell on their watch, all the while they were helpless to really do something about it, was frustrating for the clones. What they saw since their arrival on Coruscant was seldom the same they were taught about the Republic. To be fair, for those like Ren who went about the galaxy fighting all over the place ever since the war began, he saw things in a perspective. The Republic was huge. It was a miracle it worked as well as it did, and a lot of what he saw he actually liked, especially during his brief free time when he had as close to unrestricted access to the holonet as regulations and local infrastructure allowed. Soon enough, he was convinced that what he was taught was indeed true. That while it had its share of problems, the Republic was worth protecting. That was what made the constant bickering among the Senate, their unwitting refusal to elect a new chancellor on top of a never-ending string of illicit activities coming to life over the past month were so hard on him. Ren's whole being screamed that he had to do something, to protect the Republic. However, he was bound by his training, the person he was, and his belief that orders and procedures should be followed. As far as he knew, As long as that was happening, no clone had the right to tell the Senate how to do their jobs. He didn't like it, but that was how it should be. That's why, when General Kenobi finally chose to do something, even if it was perhaps not according to all the procedures set in place, Ren had no problem following the man. He was the supreme commander of the army. Without a chancellor, General Kenobi's authority was almost absolute as long as it didn't infringe on any lawfully given contingency orders that came through proper channels. What followed? Ren froze as a lance of pain struck through his brain. He could make bits and pieces now. Some of his brother had other ideas about General Kenobi's actions. They declared them illegal, and the same was true about the unorthodox election of Chancellor Satine. It was true she wasn't elected by the Senate, but in the end that was a lesser sticking point than it should have been. Ren's loyalty was to the Republic. The Republic was made up by its member states, and ultimately it was run according to their will. So when all was said and done, the Senate wasn't strictly speaking necessary for there to be a chancellor, right? Perhaps it was a rules layering. Some of his brothers called it splitting hairs. It might have been his frustration with the situation on Coruscant and the perceived failure of the Senate to do their jobs. In the end, a good clone had to acknowledge a dully elected chancellor as the supreme authority. As far as Ren was concerned, the support of Kuwait and the biggest relevant systems that made up the Republic was good enough, even if enough senators disagreed to block a more formal election. That was good enough for him, though it was occasionally hard to exactly make such a view match as how his mind told him the Republic had to run. In the end it was good enough. He had enough experience away from Camino to make up his mind about that. Unfortunately, why was his mind shifting away from thinking about what exactly put him in this mess? There was a battle, one still ongoing at that. That much was nothing new for the veteran. It was the enemy, wasn't it? That would explain why his concussed mind continued to jump to when he had to fight his brother in the past, even if it was all a mock-up until thinking about it hurt, and not only his head. Nevertheless, he could finally. All that came to him were jagged images. Some had sounds he could recall, but that was it. A weird slideshow was all he could recall. Ren professing his unflinching loyalty to the Republican support for the new chancellor along with most people in his unit. The dissenters weren't particularly happy but were convinced. Besides, they didn't really want to fight their brothers either. The commander entering a briefing room, expression grim. Stunned realization that a significant number of their brothers were opposed to the change of guard in the Republic, some of them violently setting up positions around the Senate and quietly hoping that the world would suddenly begin making sense again. They were brothers. They shouldn't be fighting each other, especially when they all wanted the best for the Republic as they saw it. Then the attack came. No artillery or orbital support, which given where they were was a good news for everyone involved. Still, it was bad enough. Enough lance and fighters to block the sun clashed in the skies. Walkers advanced through the open plaza in a suicidal charge. For a brief moment, Ren wasn't sure if he could shoot at his advancing brothers. That much he clearly remembered. Yet, it was a fleeting thought. Parts from exploding gunships and transports fell like a fiery rain, then emplacements opened up and chaos reigned. Everything was a fog deeper than whatever surrounded him, making it impossible to see. Mercifully, that meant Ren couldn't recall actually shooting and killing some of his brothers. Would that last? Thy brother's blood. =RK=. Part 4. =RK=. Loyalist positions. Senate building. Coruscant. Howling gusts of wind and shock waves from dull-sounding explosions cleared the grey haze, revealing it as impossibly thick mix of smoke and dust. Immediately, Ren wished he remained blissfully ignorant. From his position, lying flat on his back, he had an excellent view of the airspace above, and now he could see what exactly was happening over there. It was a pure slaughter. Whole wings, hundreds of friendly fighters were busy gleefully butchering his misguided brothers. What little air assets the rebels had was suddenly outnumbered, outmatched, and to just top it all, caught hopelessly out of position. Larts and gunships dashed down in what too often was futile attempts to dismount their human cargo before they could be shot out of the sky. More transports could be seen coming low and fast, this time with torrent squadrons escorting them in. A trap. All this, it was a bloody trap. Ren didn't know what happened to knock him out and cause all that dust and smoke. It couldn't have been planned. However, it didn't really matter at that point, did it? He flushed with resentment. His rebellious brothers were set up. Ren could, almost, but not quite appreciate the stratagem. Offer a bait the most hot-headed couldn't refuse, set up a trap and wait for them to walk right into it. Perhaps it was better than attempting to dig them out from whatever district they went to ground, or it would have been if those weren't his brothers dying above. As if to make up a point, a Lart came into a steep drive in a vector that looked like aimed straight at him. A torrent gracefully swung after it, and only the transport pilot's incredible reflexes allowed him to somehow avoid the first burst of laser fire. That maneuver was enough to show the Lart's side to Ren. It was scorched, cratered, and the door stood out in a half-melted wreck. The sudden bang to the right caused a clone to swing perilously close to the busted door, but he somehow managed to get a hold of it and held for dear life. Why wasn't the young fool properly strapped in? It didn't matter. The Lart simply wasn't agile enough to avoid its pursuer for any longer. Another burst of laser fire and yet another explosion joined the macabre fireworks lighting up Coruscant's skies. The Lart turned in so much burning confetti, and unfortunately Ren had seen what that does to the people inside too many times already. At least this time it was fast. He doubted that anyone on board had enough time to feel the pain. All during that senseless killing, there was no sound, making it appear even more wrong. Battle weren't supposed to be silent. Even with sound-dampening systems built in helmets, combat was chaotic chorus of screams, weapons fire and explosions. This silence simply wasn't right. Blue and red blaster bolts flew above the wounded soldier. His attention snapped back to his surroundings and he cursed himself for not paying attention. Now that the smoke and whatever nasty dreck was inside was more or less gone, Ren could see some of his part of the plaza. The defensive positions around him were in a disarray. He could clearly see dozens of his brothers scattered like broken toys. Some had parts of them twisted in unnatural angles, others missed arms or legs, yet more looked like that large shrapnel tore right through their armor, leaving them as little more than bloody smear on the ground. A walker laid frozen with a huge jagged piece of metal piercing its side. Ren winced. The sheer shock would have messed up the crew something fierce. Something that large, hitting fast enough to embed itself in the armor. No wonder the machine looked like someone took a huge hammer and went to vent on it. Max? Benny? Ren croaked, calling for the only two people of his original squad to survive the war so far. They were lucky and emerged from everything the Seppies threw at them unscratched so far. It wasn't right that they would get wounded or worse because their own brothers. It simply wasn't. He got a response all right, just not the type he wanted. A damaged walker stumbled through the smoke. Its right front leg wasn't working properly, slowing it down, but it came in undeterred. Soon infantry support emerged like apparitions from the haze. That direction. Those weren't friendly. Ren couldn't do a thing. When they tried to move, his body locked down in agony. Damn, he was surely messed up. Where were the medics when you really needed them? Another wounded was even less fortunate, if apparently less injured. Ren saw a hint of movement when one of his downed brothers raised a blast using his one working arm. His stirring was enough for the advancing rogues, and they weren't feeling generous. A barrage of blaster fire flash fried the whole area where the wounded man was showing one last gesture of defiance. Why, damn it? Why? Ren spat. It was senseless. Those were his brothers, not separatist killing machines. What was the point? Was even one with what was happening above? What did those fools hope to accomplish? Ren was both proud and furious at them. He doubted that if their places were switched he would simply lay down his weapons or go on with following orders from illegitimate source. That however changed nothing. His brothers kept killing each other, both on the ground and in the sky. Another wounded stirred. This time shots flew both sides, but the outcome was the same. With everyone having shields, a single burst simply wasn't enough to take out someone in a proper armor, and when a whole squad shot back at someone wounded who was unable to take cover or evade, the outcome was more than predictable. The third time was almost expected, though this time the advanced rogues didn't even wait for someone to shoot at them. Ren wasn't sure that the brother they saw moving was even armed. They either didn't care anymore at this point or didn't want to take chances. Was this how he was destined to end? His friends laying broken around him, perhaps already dead. His brothers about to shoot him like a wounded dog, while more of his flesh and blood murdered each other in an insane orgy of destruction. For the first time in his life, Ren wondered why he was made in the first place if this was how he was about to end. They were brothers, damn it. Family. They shouldn't be killing each other because the damned to hell Senate acted as short-signed fools. In his anger, Ren moved too much and shook in agony. The advancing clones saw him and raised their weapons. He glared at them, daring them to put him out of his misery. At least that way the pain would stop. One of them lowered his weapon when he saw him, but the others. Ren's ears were still ringing, and even if they weren't, he might have not heard what was said. He saw the point man shake his head and then he opened fire. So that's how it. Ren blinked. He should be dead already. He saw the shots coming, then a blur. And suddenly someone stood before him and the other clones. None of the shots connected with either Ren or his savior, who intercepted them with his blue lightsaber. A Jedi here? It took him a few moments to remember that General Kenobi used to be one, though this didn't look like him. Then who? Skywalker? Yes. That had to be him. There were no other loyal Jedi left on Coruscant. The few traitors still being hunted weren't going to show their faces here, where everyone would go after them for what they caused. Ren cursed, being unable to hear. He was sure that words were exchanged when, after the initial barrage, the Rouges didn't immediately open fire for all they were worth. For few precious moments, Ren hoped that whatever Skywalker was saying might sway them. He didn't want to see more of his brothers die today. =RK= Part 5. Loyalist Positions. Senate Building. Coruscant. Anakin knew he messed up as soon as he jumped off that platform overlooking the war-torn plaza. He should have remained up there, close to the entrances of the Senate. Instead, he left the months cooped up either in a cell or home arrest get to him. While it wasn't the Jedi thing to do, he had to admit, at least to himself, he missed the exhilaration of combat, something fierce. It beckoned to the darker part of his mind, the same one that felt tremendous satisfaction when he slaughtered those beasts who tortured his mother. Being in combat, without having to worry about actually commanding anyone, it was simple, liberating even. It was the freest he felt ever since the debacle at Geonosis. Oh, he knew it couldn't last, nor should it. Still, as he weaved through the chaos dispatching any rebel he could find, there was something missing and he couldn't place it. Anakin felt incomplete, desiring for something more. He didn't get much time to think about it. Lats deployed a whole platoon almost on top of his position before friendly air blew them out of the sky. For the next few minutes, the Jedi was busy using what little cover there was and his prodigious power in the Force to deal with them while remaining unscratched. Though the armor and built-in deflector sure helped, or he could have been in a spot of trouble. That was when he sensed a tremor in the Force. It spoke of danger, and Anakin didn't waste any time to respond. He got behind a wrecked walker and ducked low while surrounding himself with his power. Only then did he notice that the direction of the danger pointed at the Senate, but by then it was far too late. Blinding light followed by a deafening thunderclap slammed into Anakin. The shock wave was strong enough to shake the multi-ton vehicle he hid behind, and without the Force he didn't want to know what it would have done to him. Grey dust, nasty-looking black smoke and concealment rounds soon covered the whole plaza, but not before Anakin could see that the right end of the Senate building was struck by some heavy ordnance and practically invisible by the after effects of the explosion. At least it wasn't a proper capital-scale weaponry, if they would be all gone. Padme. That single though shook him out of the shock. She should be in the building but far away from that section. Would she be all right? The Senate was built to survive such punishment, otherwise that hit would have been gutted, the whole structure. But what about the people inside? All he wanted to do then and there was run back to check on his wife. He shouldn't have let himself get lost in the moment and jumped down. Now it would take him too damn long to reach her, Jedi abilities or not. Anakin made for the building anyway, then paused. He wasn't going to make it in time if there was a follow-up attack. He was too far away. However, how could he not at least try? By this point there had to be reinforcements pouring in from all directions to slam the trap shut around the rebels. They would get to Padme and the others in time, and Obi-Wan was in the building too. He could keep them safe, right? Keep her safe. Anakin screamed in frustration. He knew his duty, he knew himself too. He did promise he wouldn't get people needlessly killed trying to save her again. He also promised that she was his highest priority anyway. Still, he needed to run to her side. Padme was his light, the one thing that kept him sane after Tatooine and his mother's death. Without her presence, he might have very well fallen after getting his vengeance upon the Sand People. He took a step towards the Senate, then another and another, his mind and heart locked in conflict. Only now did he actually see the clones injured by the explosion. They laid all around him and most were unmoving. He faltered. Could he leave them behind again? Could he betray them? For a moment it didn't matter that he had made up his mind that Padme was the most important. Until then and there, he hadn't admitted even to himself, not really, despite what he kept telling himself, how deep betraying the 501 St cut him. Could he trust Obi-Wan and the clones to keep Padme safe? Could he trust anyone with her? Anakin certainly didn't want to. She was his wife. He was the one supposed to protect her, even if her stubbornness was a pain to deal with. He looked at the Senate, at the broken clones all around him, and then back to the plazas proper where the rebels were still advancing, yet all he could see was a grey haze. Anakin gripped his lightsaber hard enough that the metal protested. Through the Force he could still sense a rough estimation of what was happening. This position was shattered with no hope of holding. The reinforcements were coming in hot and would stop the enemy on the ground from reaching the Senate building itself, but they would be able to overrun the scattered survivors in this sector. "Be all right, Padme, please," Anakin whispered and gave the Senate a longing look before he steeled his resolve, his mind made up, and he charged in the smoke. The uncanny perception granted by the Force was a lifesaver. Whatever was in the smoke was enough to block the vision modes of his helmet, leaving him to rely on only sound, which was practically useless because of the roar of the guns and the air battle. The same was true for the clones, and that meant the rebels' day suddenly got even worse. Anakin dashed through the haze like an apparition from a spacer's tale, cut through or crushed a few soldiers and was gone before their friends could find him. He probably cut through at least a company and even disabled a walker whose crew was unable to properly track him despite the machine's better sensors. He was simply too fast when enhanced by the Force. Eventually the smoke cleared and Anakin found himself in the wrecked remains of a loyalist position. Not a single clone there was standing, and most of them looked dead. An advancing rebel platoon with a walker support was busy shooting up anyone that tried to resist. That surreal sight was enough of a shock to make him pause. He had seen separatist droids do the same when they won the field, but clones doing it to their own? It was unthinkable. What battle madness took over everyone? The rebels were about to shoot another of their wounded brothers when Anakin jumped in between them and parried the incoming shots. "Enough," he roared. The Force pulsed through him, following his unconscious decree. The rebels paused and listened. "That's enough," he repeated in a more normal tone. "It's all over." Anakin nodded upwards, where the sky was already visible along with the rebels' few remaining fighters and all their air-mobile elements being slaughtered. "It's not while we can still fight," the clone in the lead shouted back so he could be heard. "We fight for the Republic, for democracy and freedom. We can't stand down." "Listen you yourself, soldier. Didn't you see what has been happening for weeks now?" Anakin snapped. He had little to do during his house arrest but to watch the political crisis unfold with sick fascination. Thanks to Padme, Satine and Obi-Wan, he knew exactly what was happening behind closed doors, and that was even worse than all the dirty laundry being aired in public. Chancellor Kenobi can bring peace and security to the Republic if people just let her do her job. You all saw what has been happening on Coruscant. It's as bad or worse all over the core. We need a strong, sure leadership, not the useless bickering of the Senate. Not if the price is treason, Jedi. We didn't let your kind's coup succeed. What made you think we wouldn't oppose the Kenobi's one? There was no coup, damn you, Anakin snapped. He would be among the first to admit that the way Satine and Obi-Wan handled the situation was sneaky and not entirely above the board. But what alternative did they have? Let the Republic fall while the Senate bickers? Most of the clones did agree too, didn't they? Damn right there was one from where we're standing. Another clone shouted. This wasn't going as well as Anakin wanted. The rush of combat was leaving him, and suddenly he wasn't looking forward fighting people who should by all rights be on his side. Not again, damn it. Where was Obi-Wan when you needed him? He was the silver-tongued negotiator. Anakin always had been the better one with lightsaber, not to mention as a pilot, but none of that was of any use right then and there, was it? He didn't want to cut down those soldiers, just because they were misguided fools.